Now it's time to see scoping in action in a semi-complex example to make sure that you really get this super important concept. And as always, let's start by opening up a new VS Code window with our starter files. So that's already here at my desktop. And again, I have the prettier configuration here. The index is not really important here. And so let's just start writing some JavaScript code here. And I'm going to start by writing a simple calc_h function. And this time, let's actually use a function declaration. Not that it matters, but just to have some diversity and not always create the same type of function. So calc_h, which is going to receive a birth year. And then all this function does is to calculate an age. And so this is nothing new at this point. So the current year minus the birth year. Then let's also return that age here. And so this calc_h function here is, as we learned in the last lecture, defined in a global scope. And that's because it is here in the top level code, right? Also, this function here creates its own scope, and that scope is going to be equivalent to the variable environment of its execution context. So that's all the stuff we learned over the past couple of lectures. And now let's create a global variable here. So I'm going to call that one first name. And now let's actually call the function. So calc_h with 1991. And then here inside of this calc_h function, I will log first name to the console. So first name. Now, as you see, this first name variable is not actually in this scope of the calc_h function. However, it is a global variable that we defined out here. And so therefore, through the scope chain, it's going to be made available also inside of this scope. So inside of this function, right? So let's just execute this code here just to see that it actually works. And then we're going to explain a little bit more. So live server. And so here we go. Let's open up the console. Let's reload to get rid of this error. And OK. So you see that indeed Jonas here was printed to the console, which is the first name variable. And so when this line of code here was executed, JavaScript did not find this variable in this scope. And so it did a variable lookup, where it looked up in the scope chain to see if it found the variable there. And indeed, the parent scope of the calc_h function is the global scope. And the first name variable is in there, and therefore JavaScript could then use that. Now here, if we tried, for example, just name, then JavaScript would also do a lookup, but it would not find this variable in the global scope. And therefore, we would get an error. Now with this variable, actually, we would get no error. As I explained to you in the beginning, this is kind of a special variable name that we should not use. So let's say I used last name. And so again, this variable is nowhere to be found. So even by doing a lookup into the parent scope. And so now when I save this, then I get this last name is not defined error. Okay. And so going back here to first name, then of course, everything works just the same. And that is true, even though this variable here was actually defined after the calc_h function. But that's not a problem at all, because remember that the code in the function is only executed once it's actually called. And so that happens after the declaration of the first name variable. So right here. And so at this point in the code, the first name variable is already in the global execution variable environment. So in the global scope, ready to be used. Okay, but let's actually get rid of this here. And let's create another function inside of this function. So function print age, and this will print a nice string to the console. And as you also know already, it also creates a new scope. And let's create an output variable, which is going to be the string that we will build here. So output equals you are the age, and I forgot the curly braces, born in birth year. And then we simply log that message to the console. And now to actually see this result here, we need to, of course, call the function. So let's do that right here. So print age. And now we get this string with all the data that we actually computed, and it works just fine. So we get the age that was calculated here, and also the birth year that was passed into this function. And so here again, we see the magic of the scope chain in action. So once again, the engine, as it is executing this print age function, is trying to access or is trying to find the age variable in the current scope. However, it cannot find it there, and so therefore it goes to the parent scope, where it will then find this age variable, of course, that we created here. And the same is true for the birth year variable, because for scoping, the parameter of a function works just like normal variables. And also remember that we say that the scope of a variable is the entire region of the code in which the variable is accessible. So for example, the scope of the age variable is all of this area here. So everywhere here, the age variable is accessible. So of course in the calc_age function where it was defined, and then also in all the child scopes, so all the inner scopes, okay? But of course, age is not accessible outside of the calc_age scope. So let me demonstrate that here. So here we will not be able to access the age variable. And that is because, as I mentioned, the scope chain is a one-way street. So only an inner scope can have access to the variables of its outer scope, but not the other way around. So now here we are in the outer scope, and we cannot have access to the variables of a child scope, which the scope of the calc_age function here surely is. Okay, and the same goes for functions again, and so we cannot call the print age function out here for the same reason. So let's comment out this one. And so now we get print age is not defined. Okay, so here in the global scope, we do not have access to any variables defined in any other scope. All right. And here let's actually take it to the next level and also include the name of the person. So let's say first name, and let's try this now. And indeed, it does have access to the first name variable. And so here the engine is doing an even bigger or longer variable lookup. So right now we are of course in the print age scope here. And so then JavaScript cannot find the variable in the current scope. So it looks up in the scope chain, which is then the next step, the calc_age function. However, it can also not find first name in this scope, and therefore it goes up even further into the global scope. And there it is. And so this is the value that is going to be used. Okay, so I hope all of this made sense until this point. Let's now go further and also create a block scope right here in this print age function. So let's do an if statement here. And we will check if the person based on the birth year is a millennial. And so that is if you were born between 1981 and 1996, then you're a millennial. And so let's check for that. So birth year needs to be at least 1981 and below below 1996. And so here we are creating a block, and therefore this will be a new block scope. And so let's now define a variable here using const. And I'm going to call it string. And let's say, so first we get this string here to the console, and then we can also say, so if the person is a millennial, we will say, oh, and you're a millennial. And then again, the first name. And so now we are adding even one more step here to the scope chain, because now the lookup for first name is even longer, but it still will work. So let me log that to the console. And so in this case, I am clearly a millennial, okay? And again, Jonas here is still found all the way here from the outer scope. But now, what do you think will happen as we try to log this variable outside of this block scope? So basically do the same, but outside of the block. So indeed, we get an error that str is not defined. And again, that's because const and let variables are block scoped. So they are valid, so they are available only inside the block in which they were created. But now watch as we create yet another variable, which I will call millennial. And let's set it to true. And so this is an old pre-ES6 variable. And so what do you think will happen as we log it also here outside of this block? So we need to comment out this one. So again, what do you think is going to happen now? And JavaScript can actually find it. And so that is because of the fact that var variables, so variables declared with the var keyword, are function scoped. So they simply ignore the block because they are not block scoped at all. They're just function scoped. And so here we are still in the same function. So here we are trying to access the variable that was defined in the same function, right? So right now, the scope of the millennial variable is this entire function, no matter if it was declared inside of a block or not. Because again, var variables do not care about blocks at all. And so therefore, we can then access the millennial variable inside of its scope. Okay? So keep that in mind as you use or as you see a variable declared with var, right? Because as I said, on your own, you should probably not use this variable yourself. Always just use const or let. But if you are reading other code bases or even working with older code, then keep in mind that this is how the var variable works. And so that's why it's very important to learn about this here as well. Okay, next up, let's prove that functions are also in fact block scoped starting in ES6. So let's just create a simple function here that will add two values. Return a plus b. And then let's attempt to call it here outside of the block. So add 2 and 3. And now we get add is not defined. And so, in fact, the scope of this add function here is only the block in which it was defined. So only here we can use the add function. And so that proves that functions are now in fact block scoped. But remember that that is only true for strict mode. And so that's the mode that we're actually currently in. But if I turn this off, you should see now actually add being called. So let's log the result of that to the console. And so we should now see 5. And indeed, now it works. All right, but we should always use strict mode. And so now we should get that error back. And so let's also comment this out. And so you can keep this here as a reference. Okay, and now to finish, let's do some experiments here. So what do you think is going to happen if we declare a variable in this scope here? So in this new block scope that already exists in a parent scope. So for example, let's say here, const first name equals Stephen. So what do you think this string here will look like now? So do you think that here it will say Jonas or Stephen? Well, let's try. And in fact, it now says Stephen. And that happens because, as always, JavaScript tries to look for the variable name in the current scope. And right now, it actually is in the current scope. So first name is indeed in this same block, so in this same scope. And so therefore, JavaScript will then use that variable and not perform any variable lookup in the scope chain. So the scope chain isn't necessary at all if the variable that we're looking for is already in the current scope. And so that's exactly the case right here. But of course, then outside of this block, the first name variable is still going to be the one coming from the scope chain. So that's why here you still see Jonas. So right here in the print h function, which is another scope, so it's the parent scope of this scope, right? And so here, first name is still Jonas, because it is not in the current scope of this function, and therefore JavaScript will make a variable lookup in the scope chain until it can find first name, which is still Jonas, coming from down here. So here we created a new variable with the same name of another variable that we had already created in a parent scope. So we have two first name variables right now, but that is not a problem at all, because in fact they are completely different variables. They simply happen to have the same name, but that's not a problem at all, because they are defined in different scopes. And so you can have repeated variable names. That's absolutely no problem. And that's also the reason why you can have different functions with the same parameter names, because again, each parameter is only defined in that scope of that function. And therefore, it's not a problem at all to have many functions with the exact same parameter names, in the same way that it's not a problem to have functions with the same variable names inside of them. But now watch what happens when we redefine a variable from a parent scope inside of an inner scope. So not creating a new variable, but simply reassigning the value of a variable. So let's do that here. And let's now say output equals new output. And here we then have to change the output to a let. But let's just analyze what we did here. So we are in the print h scope. So that's all of this here. And in here we have the output variable. Then we have a inner scope, so like a child scope here, which then redefines this output variable from the outer scope. And so if we then try to access that output here again, what do you think is going to happen? Well, we get new output here. And that is because we actually manipulated an existing variable here inside of a child scope, so inside of an inner scope, right? We did not create a new variable. We simply redefined a variable that we accessed here from the parent scope. So if we did create a new variable called output here, then we would have the same situation as before with first name. So this would then be a completely different variable and would not at all affect the output from the outer scope. And so now, as we save this, then this new output should disappear and should be back to the original output as we defined it in the scope now. So indeed, now the new output is gone. And again, That's because it is now its own variable. So a brand new variable which just happens to have the same name as a variable from its parent scope. But to illustrate this here, let's actually leave it like this. And I will also comment it, creating new variable with same name as outer scopes variable. And let's put this together here. Reassigning outer scopes variable. So again, two completely different things, but I think this is a very nice example to once again illustrate how the scope chain works. And with this, I hope that you now completely understand how scoping works in JavaScript. Also, just keep in mind that real code should probably not be this confusing, but this was just to show you how scoping works.